Okay, hello everybody. I don't know if anyone still sings this song. We used to sing it when I was a kid, and it was called Dare to be a Daniel. And it said, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. It's a really good song because Daniel is a good example of someone who had a purpose in his heart. And no matter what happened in his life, he kept that purpose, and that was to serve and honor God. And he had to go through some pretty dangerous times in order to keep his purpose, but God honored that and helped him through all of it. And we're going to talk about Daniel today. There's a verse that says, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. And if you want to be a Daniel, then you will need to do that too. Be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. So, over the last number of weeks, we have been talking about the kings of Israel and Judah. And some were good and some were bad, and what happened to all of them. Well, in the end, Israel went farther and farther into worshiping idols. And there were some good kings right up till almost the end, in Judah particularly. None in Israel, although some of them were less bad than others. But the worshiping of idols was what God did not want the Israelites to do. When he brought them into the land of Canaan, he said, you can stay here as long as you obey my word. And when you go against me and start to worship other gods, then you will be taken captive to other lands. You won't have your own land to live in anymore. That will be your punishment. Well, strangely enough, the people did not listen to that. We can all be guilty of not doing what we know is right or doing things that we know is wrong. So, because Israel, the land to the north, here's our map, because Israel, the split part of the nation of Israel that was to the north and did not have the city of Jerusalem and the temple of God in it, they had been encouraged to worship golden calves and other idols. They were taken first. There was a country called Assyria. It became very, very large in those days. And this green part is all, both shades of green, that's all Assyria. So you can see over here is the Mediterranean. So here, this little red bit is Israel and the pink bit is Judah. And then all this green area, the Euphrates and the Tigris River is encompassed in that. It was a very fertile area, and all the way up to Mount Ararat and down to, I think that's the Arabian Sea. That was all Assyria. They became so big and mighty, and since so many people lived in that area of the world, I have a globe, but I wouldn't be able to show you exactly how that looked because it's hard to see. But so many people lived in that area that if you ruled that area, basically, in the Bible times, it was referred to as ruling the whole world because so many people lived there. So Assyria came first. They took over Israel, and what they did was they took all, or most, if not all, of the Israelites out of Israel and took them back to their other lands and made them live there. And then they took people from the rest of their empire of Assyria to come and live in the houses and fields and own the things that the Israelites had once had. That way the Israelites would not be all together to be able to plot against their new nation king. And so it was a good way to make sure that everybody got assimilated and they all became part of the Assyrian Empire and weren't able to make a rebellion against them. So years went by and God spared Judah at that time. There were still people who worshiped God. The temple was there. Jerusalem was there. God loved Jerusalem and the city of David, he called it. There was a king Hezekiah near the end who was a good king and trusted God. But later Judah did go back to worshiping idols and doing great evil. And so God sent the next nation that came after Assyria against Judah. So the Assyrians had taken over a huge portion of the world at that time. where most of the people lived. And then the Babylonians came and conquered Assyria, and they took over all of Assyria and made the borders even bigger as they conquered other places. And so the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar came and conquered Judah. And just like the Assyrians had done, they took the people of Judah and they put them in other places in Babylon. They also broke down the beautiful temple that Solomon had built. Remember, there was wonderful things in there, lots of gold and such. And so they came and they broke that all down, and they took the gold back with them to their kingdom. And they took all the vessels, the cups and the bowls and things that were made out of gold that had been dedicated for the service of the Lord in the temple. They took those back as well. And they took people, particularly what our story is about, they took young men who were noblemen, possibly even sons of the king, princes, if they were of a certain age, so they would be in their late teens. They were intelligent, so they could learn easily. They wanted to teach them the language of the Chaldeans, the teachings of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were the wise men of Babylon. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he was pretty smart. He knew what he was doing. He would take all of the good, healthy, they had to look good. They had to be good looking. They couldn't be missing pieces or anything. So if they were good looking, they were intelligent, easy, they could learn things easily. They were sons of rich families, so that they would be already have good manners, so they could stand in court and not be embarrassing in front of the king. They took those young men and they brought them all the way back to the city of Babylon. And the king Nebuchadnezzar put a man named Ashpenaz in charge of all these young men. He was in charge of making sure they had food to eat, and they got to eat the food off the king's own table and the wine that he drank, so that they could have the best of the best and be healthy in order to learn and grow. And they were supposed to be taught and nourished, the Bible says, for 3 years. And then they would come before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he would quiz them. They'd have a big exam after 3 years, an oral exam in front of the king himself. And if they did well, they would be basically hired to be some of the king's wise men, and they would be able to live in the palace and give him information and advice as he needed it. Okay, so I think we covered all of that. Yes. So here we are in Babylon. This is King Nebuchadnezzar, and of course an artist rendition of what he may look like. Among the young men that were taken from Judah, from the noblemen, probably around the age of 16 or 17, there were 4 that we're going to be concentrating on. One was named Daniel, and they each had special meanings to their names, so I'm going to read what they were. Daniel meant God is my judge, and he had 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they meant, gift of the Lord, and he that is the strong God, and the Lord is a help. So each one of them had parents that honored God, and they named their sons to honor the Lord God, the true God. Well, the Babylonians didn't like this idea. Not only did they take the people of Israel and Judah from their homeland, but they wanted to get rid of all traces of their loyalty to their background. And they didn't like this new God, and so they changed their names to reflect the gods of Babylon. So Daniel became Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And most people probably know them by that name better. Well, when they got to the place where all the young men were taken and they were sat down with a big feast. First, they had to walk all the way there. That was a long journey. But once they got there, they had all the food from the king's own table set before them. I'm sure the other young men were probably happy. They were like, yes, this isn't so bad. We get to live in the royal palace and eat good food. All we have to do is learn a new language and some new science things, and life will be good. But Daniel and his friends saw something different. They saw foods that had been sacrificed to idols. They saw foods that in the law of God that he gave to the Israelites when he took them out of Egypt and they were in the desert. In those laws, he gave them specific instructions about what they were and were not allowed to eat. And they were looking at the table and they were seeing lots of food that God said not to eat. So Daniel purposed in his heart not to put any of that stuff into his body. But he was a wise young man, and he went to Ashpenaz, the one who was in charge, and he said, is there any chance that I and my 3 friends here can have different food? This is all very lovely food, but we would like to have some vegetables. The Bible calls it pulse. It could have been like a vegetable stew or something like that. Anyways, it was mainly vegetables. He said, can we have that? And Ashpenaz said, what, you want to endanger my head before the king? I was told to feed you this stuff. And if I give you vegetables, then you're going to get really skinny and sickly looking, and the king will kill me. Like, no, you have to eat what you're given. But Daniel didn't give up. He had purposed in his heart. He went to someone who was underneath Ashpenaz, who was in charge of his little group, and he had a new proposition. He said, do you mind if my friends and I just have vegetables for 10 days, just 10 days, and then you can check us out. And if we look really sick and pale and unhealthy, then we'll eat the king's food. But if we look healthy, then how about we just keep on eating vegetables? And so the servant did agree to this plan, and Daniel used respect and consideration when he asked for this. And sure enough, after 10 days, Daniel and his friends actually looked more healthy than all the other boys. So he was like, sure, go ahead. You can keep eating your vegetables. At the end of the 3 years, when Nebuchadnezzar did his grand exam, it was found that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were among the wisest of all the wise men, not just the young men that had been with them and taken from Judah, but even the older wise men who were part of the Chaldeans in the kingdom. And so they were given high places in the kingdom as wise men. Well, then one night the king had a dream. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it bothered him so much it woke him up, and he called all the wise men he considered astrologers, people that tried to tell the future by reading the stars, and soothsayers, so like magicians and people like that, to be wise. And then he had his Chaldeans, who actually were like book studying wise men who studied science and things. He called them all to him, and he said, I've had a dream. I want you to tell me what it means, because it's really bothering me. And the wise men said, oh yes, King Nebuchadnezzar, we will do that for you. You just tell us what the dream is, and we will tell you what it means. And the king said, no, I'm not going to tell you the dream. It's gone from me. I can't remember what it is. You tell me what the dream is, and then tell me what it means, and then I'll know that you're actually as wise as you say you are. And they said, no king has ever asked this of his wise men. It's impossible. There is no person on earth that can tell you what your dream was. And the king said, well, then you're not much good, are you? You can all be killed. So he sent out the decree that all the wise men in his whole kingdom would be killed. So that included Daniel and his friends. Well, when the captain of the guard came to Daniel's house to tell him what was going on, that they were all the wise men were going to die, Daniel once again used tact and respect and consideration and asked, well, can you tell me why the king has made this decree? And the captain of the guard liked Daniel. That was one of the beautiful things about Daniel. God loved Daniel because he had purposed in his heart to honor God. And because of that, God allowed Daniel to find a place in other people's hearts. God softened the hearts of the people around Daniel to make them like him. So the captain of the guard liked Daniel, and he explained to Daniel everything that had happened. And Daniel said, can you go and tell the king that I will talk to God about his problem, and if he can just give me some time, I believe I can tell him his dream and what it means. So the captain of the guard was happy to go back and tell the king that if he would just give Daniel time, that he would be able to help him out. So, what did Daniel do? He told his 3 friends, and they all started praying. They prayed and they prayed and they prayed. And then God gave Daniel a vision of what the king's dream had been. So what the king saw was a huge statue with a head of gold, shoulders, torso, arms of silver, hips of brass, I believe it was, and legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And he also told Daniel what the dream meant. So Daniel was able to go and talk to the king and say, "Oh king, I can tell you what your dream was and what it means." Well, the king was so glad to hear this. And so Daniel described the dream, how he saw the statue, the metals, what it was made of, how he saw a stone that was cut out of a mountain without hands, and how the stone rolled down and smashed against the weak feet of this statue, and the whole thing fell down and was disintegrated by this big stone. I don't think that does it justice. And then the stone grew until it became a whole mountain that filled the earth. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was excited. Yes, that was it. That was definitely my dream. So then Daniel went on to explain the dream. He said, "O king, you are the head of gold, and after you will come other nations, the silver, the bronze, the iron and clay, and the stone, which is cut out of the mountain without hands, is God's power, and it will come and smash the feet of this statue, which is actually representative of kingdoms that rule the world, and the whole thing will fall down and be pulverized to dust, and then God's power as the mountain will grow and fill the whole world." Now, we know, looking back in history, that if Nebuchadnezzar was the head, that was the Babylonians, and we know that the Medes and the Persians came after, and then we know that the Greeks came after that, and the Romans came after that, and those feet have not yet been pulverized, so they must be a future event. So the king was very excited that Daniel had been able to tell him the dream and what it meant. And he said, "Your God is a God above all gods." And he made Daniel and his 3 friends high rulers in the nation of Babylon as a result of what Daniel did for him. And the other wise men weren't killed either because of that. Oh, here we are. We have the words here. So we have Babylon, Medo-Persians, Greece, Rome, and the rock is Jesus, the rock of ages, that comes and smashes the whole thing and then fills the whole earth, because he will rule the whole earth in the future. He will be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, not just in heaven, but also here on earth. Okay, I can see the time is quickly clicking by. I will stop for today, although we don't have much time to go through to get to the right story at Christmas, but I will stop here and we will take up Daniel again next week. Remember his character. You will see it throughout the book of Daniel and his purpose to honor God in all things. Just like the little servant girl in the story of Naaman that we talked about before, how she was removed from her family and her home in Israel and taken to another place, and there she told them about the prophet of God and the true God, and therefore Naaman went and was healed and brought the news of this all-powerful, mighty, holy God back to where he lived and worshiped him there, and I'm sure shared about that with other people. Daniel was taken from his home, taken to some other place, and he was able to share about the Almighty God with the people there. And those people did not know of a God that could actually do miracles and help them. They worshipped idols, mouths that can't speak, eyes that can't see, ears that can't hear. And so this was a very good thing. God can bring good things out of bad things. It was bad that the people of Judah did not worship God. They worshipped idols, and they had to be taken from their home and taken to other lands as a punishment for that. But God still had his chosen people that he could use, and he was able to honor himself, and the word of his power could be spread to other nations as a result of the faithfulness of those who still worshipped him, that were taken to other places and then shared about him. And so we're going to hear more about what Daniel and his friends did next week. Okay, so have a great week. Thanks. Bye.